Hi comrades, I want to welcome you to tonight's launch of the Anticapitalist Platform, a strategy, a programme for Momentum, the Labour left and the socialist left in Britain and internationally. So tonight, the world stands on the threshold. It has major decisions to make about the future of the struggles that it wants to participate in. With what we see going on in America, everyone across Britain over the last evenings has been on protests, and around the world we've seen solidarity movements rising up. The uprising against anti-Black racism and police terror in the USA is only the latest of the international struggles against climate change, against women's oppression, and for international solidarity and national liberation. And so as today we see the world standing on the threshold in Britain, Momentum and the Labour left also stands on the threshold, and it has to decide which way it will turn to orientate itself, to relate itself to the movements that are rising up today. And so this evening, I'm proud to introduce our three candidates for the Anticapitalist Platform, beginning with Erta Machikena, who will be introducing our platform with two other candidates, and then plenty of time for discussions and contributions. So thank you for participating, and please hold on for the discussion, and hope to join you for that later.
Hi everyone, my name is Erta and I'm standing on the Anticapitalist Platform in the London region. I joined the Labour Party in 2015 during Jeremy Corbyn's first leadership campaign, and for the last few years I've been campaigning within Labour against Brexit, for migrants' rights, and for democracy and accountability within the movement. Last year I was a founding member of Labour for Socialist Europe, a campaign set up to fight for an anti-capitalist, internationalist alternative to Brexit. Yesterday, I went to the Black Lives Matter demonstration in central London against police violence and institutional racism, and I saw something that I haven't seen for a long time in the Labour Party. I saw the beginning of a movement confident of its own strength and prepared to fight. I think Momentum and the Labour Party started out that way 5 years ago, a mass movement of people committed to a socialist alternative. But now we've lost 2 elections and we've lost control of the party to a leadership which is not at all concerned with mass politics, is already rolling back the radical policy gains of the Corbyn years and persecuting left-wing members. At the same time, the world is about to go into the biggest economic crisis of our lifetimes, with far-right governments in power around the world, all of that compounded by the threat of climate change and 10 years left to save the planet. The effects of all these crises will fall overwhelmingly on the workers, the poor, and the oppressed. Over the last month, we've already seen more people become unemployed in a single month than at any other time since records began. That's just the beginning, and it comes on top of more than a decade of crumbling public services and austerity. So as we debate how to go forward as a movement, we first need to recognize that we're in a totally different situation now than we have been for the last 5 years. The terrain of struggle that we're on has shifted under our feet. We're no longer debating about 2 sets of policy options for Labour, but the period ahead is going to be a test of our collective response as a movement to a series of deep and systemic global crises. We're not going to see another election probably for the next 5 years, and we can't afford to wait for that to change the world. We need to ask ourselves now, where did we go wrong? What lessons can we learn? And how can we organize ourselves to act? So through the Anticapitalist Platform, we're putting forward some key lessons that we think the movement needs to learn to put itself on a fighting footing and make itself relevant in the crises ahead. First, we think democratic structures are essential. That's not because democracy is an abstract moral good, but because it's an essential prerequisite to ensure that an organization represents and fights for the interests of its members. The reason that Momentum under Corbyn became less and less democratic is because it needed to suppress the movement's independence, to make sure that the movement's demands didn't go beyond what the MPs and the trade union leaders thought was acceptable, and within the boundaries of electability, the constraints of maintaining party unity by making compromises with the party's right wing. And it felt it had to do that because it didn't see itself as fighting to build an independent socialist movement based on the politics decided by its members, but it decided to exclusively focus on electing Corbyn supporters to committees and then getting Corbyn into government. Because of that, it increasingly started relying on bureaucratic maneuvers and backroom deals and shot itself in the foot on its greatest strength, which is the mass engagement of its members who are fighting for a fundamental and irreversible transformation of society. For example, Momentum refused to come out with a position on Brexit, even though it knew that its members were overwhelmingly against Brexit, because it felt it had to go along with the leadership's failed electoral calculation of trying to please everyone, and in the process, abandon its internationalist principles. It did things like promote Corbyn's promises of 10,000 more bobbies on the beat and suggest that more police could solve knife crime instead of building the mass anti-racist movement that we need. It refused to stand up for automatic open selection within the party, even though that was the absolute core of Corbyn's democratisation agenda for the party, because Corbyn had decided to make a compromise with the trade union leadership. And last year, it refused to back the radical motion on freedom of movement that members overwhelmingly supported because it thought that it would be too radical for the electorate, and it didn't speak up when the leadership dropped that from its manifesto. I think the result of all that has been that after having lost the election, the left is now disoriented. Voters have been disillusioned about the power of the Labour Party as a radical and insurgent force in society, and our enemies on the right have been strengthened, leaving us as the Labour left unprepared and unorganised for the scale of the struggles ahead. But there's still time to get organised. Now, as a movement, we need to set our own political goals and fight for them within the party and outside of it. Of course, we should participate in the Labour Party and demand that the Labour and trade union leaders back our socialist politics. But we should also recognise that our strength rests on our own self-organisation, and we need to be prepared to go our own way if necessary, organise ourselves independently. That's the only alternative to a strategy of compromise, which ultimately disarms us, dissipates our strength, and prevents us from victory. To give ourselves a clear political strategy to guide us and make ourselves relevant to the working class, we need to put ourselves in a position to lead the struggles to defend their interests. As we come out of the lockdown, the recession is really going to kick in, and the government is going to try and make us pay for the unprecedented amounts of money they've pumped into the economy to save the capitalist system, while the profits continue to flow into private pockets, just like in 2008. We're going to need a mass movement against the cuts. We're going to need to put unions on a fighting footing. We're going to need an unemployed movement fighting to share out the work with no loss of pay and organise the unprecedented numbers of unemployed that we're seeing already. I think that a lot of people in the Labour left are still fighting yesterday's political battles over this or that policy within the Labour Party, whereas we're putting forward a perspective to fight the new battles of today, to organise ourselves, recognising the overall perspectives for the movement and the new challenges facing us around the world. And we need to be ambitious about our goals and our strategies, because after all, we have an ambitious goal, not just managing things a bit more fairly within the capitalist system, but the end of that system is replacement with socialism and the irreversible liberation of humanity from exploitation and oppression. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Uta. So next I'd like to introduce Marcel from North London.
Thank you, Katie, and good evening, everybody. I'm Marcel. I'm a member of Harrow East CLP, Harrow Momentum, and I'm a supporter of Red Flag. We joined Labour in 2015 when Corbyn was elected leader, as it was clear there was an appetite inside the party for socialist policies, as well as a developing movement of socialists inside of the Labour Party. Since joining, I've had a couple of positions on my CLP's executive committee, alongside other Corbyn supporters, first as vice chair membership, and then as political education officer. I helped to run a socialist reading circle in Harrow. I've taken part in the campaigns to get a Corbyn supporter as the local candidate for the general election and then the London Assembly elections. So I'm going to speak about the Anticapitalist Platform's internationalism, and a good place to start is to say that one of the reasons I was enthused to join the Labour Party after Corbyn was elected leader was his principled history of internationalism, supporting workers' struggles abroad and opposing British imperialism. Corbyn's been a long-time member of groups like Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Stop the War, and he's been a consistent supporter of the causes of Palestine, Kurdistan and South Africa, often supporting these causes not only in Parliament but crucially in the streets as well. Famously, he was arrested during a protest against South African apartheid. He also impressively supported a number of international causes which you might not know about. He was a long-time ally of left-wing democracy activists in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. And despite attempts by the right to paint him as soft on Iran, soft as Russia, he's actually submitted more motions in Parliament on the question of human rights in Iran and Russia. But unfortunately, during the recent years, when the left was controlled, when the left controlled the Labour Party, there was too much of a departure from Corbyn's principles that he held for decades. The ruling class attacked the left leadership of Labour and their international policies and their defence policies. Journalists, right-wing politicians, and in the most extreme cases, even military generals piled in on this attack against Corbyn. And in the first few months, Labour threw its weight behind the renewal of nuclear weapons, behind the disastrous bombing campaign against Syria, and it would eventually betray national liberation causes in Palestine and Kashmir. It's not a coincidence that these were the areas of Corbyn's programme that the ruling class focused on. They knew that by first attacking left internationalism, they could more easily demand that they abandon their domestic agenda after that. They could do this because they knew that nationalism was a wedge they could divide, with which they could divide the new movement behind Corbyn and separate serious activists from those who were willing to compromise on these questions. Before long, it was almost as though the main ideology of the Corbyn project, as articulated by the bureaucratic union leaders, less radical of the left MPs, and many in the leadership of Momentum, including those standing on the other slates, was that a compromise to be made with those attacking Corbyn's leadership. They believed that if they dropped the key international demands, in exchange, Corbyn would be allowed by them to carry out progressive reforms domestically. And for much of Corbyn's leadership of the party, this supposed compromise was clearest on the question of Palestine. And beyond Labour, it was a terrible 5 years for the Palestinian cause. Thousands of protesters were shot during the Great Return marches, and the new Trump government gave the green light for more annexation with the so-called deal of the century. Meanwhile, supporters of Israel mounted an offensive against Palestine activists in Britain, with many more being referred to the authorities under prevent guidelines, and specifically the BDS campaign being targeted. In some of the more extreme cases, Conservative MPs tried not only to equate anti-Zionism support for the Palestinian cause with anti-Semitism, but anti-capitalism itself with anti-Semitism, a sign of how emboldened these supporters of the Israeli government have become. And the effects of this emboldened campaign against the Palestinian cause were worse felt inside Labour, around that time that anti-Zionists began to be unfairly expelled from the party, and when the debate surrounding the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism began. Whilst at the time, crisis around the IHRA definition, no party had themselves adopted the definition. The definition itself was pretty much okay. It was the examples attached to this definition of anti-Semitism that created serious problems. The worst of the examples actually said that calling Israel a racist state is grounds for discipline. And after a very fairly intense media campaign, it was actually the Momentum-controlled NEC that accepted this definition and adopted it as Labour policy. I think it was a mistake for us to be intimidated into moderating our position on Palestine. What we demand for the Palestinian people, after all, is precisely what socialists demand for displaced people in every other circumstance, to be allowed to exercise their rights under international law to return to towns and villages from which they were ethnically cleansed. And the left formed similar demands with the Rohingya, the Kurds, for example. In such situations, their instinct towards solidarity is still there. But unfortunately, Labour leadership couldn't make even this most basic of demands for the Palestinians, because it had made concessions to the ideology which was at the root of the occupation, which was Zionism. Many of the Momentum leadership actually themselves accepted claims that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, and by extension, that the return of Palestinian refugees is tantamount to the deprivation of Jewish rights. And we reject this. We argue for Labour to adopt a position of a state in Israel, Palestine for all its people, binational, and the immediate withdrawal of the IDF from Israeli illegally occupied zones. One other disastrous error that left's leadership made was in its handling of Brexit. And despite many interpretations of Brexit as an expression of indignation against the Tory government, this vote was actually a defeat for the left. This was a vote in which people from all classes voted against a campaign that was backed by major trade unions, the Labour Party, in favour of one which constantly drew on nationalism and opposition to immigration as its principal demand. The result is that is one that offers very few, if any, tangible benefits to the working class. It's entrenched a fantasy of socialism in one country amongst the leaders of the labour movement. But now we actually have a very different situation. Britain is no longer in the EU. The process to determine the precise terms of the departure are going to go on for years. This means that now the question is not can we or should we stop Brexit? The question is how do we fight a defensive battle against the inevitable effects of Brexit, and they're being implemented by a hard rights government under the Conservatives. How, for instance, do we build real links with workers and socialists in other parts of Europe, rather than retreating to the dead end of British road to socialism? How do we resist growing anti-migrant sentiment, which grew during and after the vote? Most importantly, how do we resist any concessions on the question of greater border controls, instead preserving the rights for free movement that we have at the moment, the limited rights that we do have? Of course, we don't consider the border policies of the last 40 years to be anything to celebrate. We want to fight this defensive battle. We also want to close the horrific detention centres which house innocent people, to apply the right to vote to all those living in Britain, and fundamentally to ensure that those from outside of Europe have all of the same rights as those from within Europe. The question is, however, whether or not it's going to be easier to fight for these rights from a position in which free movement is defended, the limited free movement we have, or one from which, along with the many civil rights, are being rolled back. And decisively, we say it has to be the former. And free movement, as much as any other issue, shows how closely our political demands are actually tied with our demands to democratize the movement and the party. So Labour passed a motion with all of the demands I've just mentioned practically at the conference last year. But just as with the equally impressive motion against the occupation of Kashmir, this was routinely ignored by the leadership. And this anti-democratic culture can't be replicated in Momentum. That's why we call for a sovereign conference to determine Momentum's policies. We've seen that not only are those only the triangulating manoeuvres of Momentum on the question like Palestine or Brexit are unprincipled, but actually that they fail on their own narrow electoralist terms. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to say that we don't consider that the Anticapitalist Platform, that's internationalism, is a bolt-on or an added extra. It's instead a core part of our programme that we understand as being entirely inseparable from our domestic demands. And as anti-capitalists, we'll fight for these international causes and resist attempts by the right to make us betray them. So thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Marcel. So you've heard from Urta in South London and Marcel in North London. And so now I'm proud to introduce Andy, our third candidate who'll be speaking to you tonight, who is a postal worker from Leeds. Andy.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Brilliant. Yeah, just from up north, it looks like it's a different time zone. I think we need to get better lamps up here, so I apologize for the light. But I just want to talk about three things today. I'm a postal worker in the CWU union, a workplace rep. We've been on the front line of the struggle for PPE and social distancing. It's been the reps in the union that have fought for that all the way, not management. We've had to push all the way for all of that to be in place. And I'm sure there's millions of other workers in the same situation and millions coming back to work who will be in that same situation. And that struggle on the shop floor is absolutely essential, right? As well as turning outwards to the mass struggles against mass resistance and mass resistance to the huge austerity that's coming. And absolutely essential that Labour and the unions, but especially Momentum leading that, turn to that. The corona crisis is going to require a mass response and mass resistance. The second thing I'd like to talk about are sort of the lessons from the last 10 years of the austerity movement, because I've been actively involved in that in Leeds, and what we did well, what we did not so well, and why we didn't succeed in stopping austerity. And then finally, you know, what's the situation going forward and how Momentum is absolutely essential to that, why Momentum's important, and why it needs to make a radical change of direction. It's clear that not just Britain, but internationally, the working class is at a crossroads, and so is the Labour left. We've got three huge, each one on their own, existential crisis almost for capitalism and for people and humanity. We've got the climate crisis, where we now have 10 years to stop catastrophic climate change. We've got the pandemic, and we've got, which is spread around the world and created a lockdown. And that has triggered a recession that was already developing out of the 2008 recession, that was already going to be possibly as deep or deeper than that, but that's triggered it and become the biggest economic crisis in a century. Millions already unemployed, and we have to rise to the level of those crises, and we have to name the system that causes them, capitalism, and link our resistance to these crises, and the bosses attempt to make us pay for them. To getting rid of the system itself and for a socialist system. I've already said what the three huge crises are. I mean, already government debt is 3 times the size of the bank bailout that Gordon Brown gave to the banks 10 years ago. We were forced to pay with that for that, with massive recession. We've seen the terrible results of that. 1 million people going to food banks. Nobody knew what a food bank was 10 years ago. Child poverty and poverty as a whole on the rise, even before the corona crisis. Millions on precarious contracts of various kinds, especially young people, the biggest fall in wages in Britain for 2 centuries. That's the kind of austerity that we needed to defeat, and we didn't succeed. And now we don't have a choice. Momentum has to turn outwards to the struggle against austerity. It can't just be a fight over policy within the Labour Party, right? That's got to be part of this wider battle. And obviously, the fall of Corbyn and the success of Keir Starmer in winning the election, and the turn rightwards already on policy. Kashmir was mentioned. There's also making renters pay their arrears back instead of just cancelling them, which was Labour Party policy before. That that is something that also existentially says to Momentum, what are we going to be? Because Momentum used to read its policies off of the Corbyn leadership and just accept those, and now we can't. We have to decide what we're going to stand for, and the crisis demands that we do. I think the first thing, what we're saying, is that Momentum at the moment remains the largest left organization in Britain. It can play a key role in the struggle, but to do so, it has to make a radical change on 4 fronts. First off, it's got to become a genuinely democratic organization rather than a top-down organization. It's got to have a rank and file approach within the unions and Labour Party, independent from the leaders and the officialdom and the bureaucrats, and ensuring that the grassroots drive things and have a say and actually are independent from those, not just led by the nose or cheering the leaders and whatever they say. Finally, we need anti-capitalist policies, and they need to be linked to the struggle for socialism and a program that represents that. And we need that now in the crisis. Absolutely, that's clear now, I think. The last thing is, to do that, we need to turn outwards. The struggle isn't just in labor around policies and how many people we get to conference. Right? We've got to have a whole-scale sea change in our approach, and that means looking outside, building the resistance, and pouring our efforts into that and demanding that labor and the unions follow suit. The first thing that means is dynamic local groups. The grassroots groups were largely suspended in 2017. And that really killed Momentum dead in many local areas when it was the most vibrant organization that I had seen in nearly 20 years as a socialist. And we need to restore that, open democratic local groups based on activism and activists, and those local groups controlling the leadership and controlling the organization as a whole through democratic conferences that set policy, that set priorities, and can develop an anti-capitalist socialist program. But one of the things that we need to do immediately is convene local groups again and develop a local plan of resistance and how we can play a role in supporting all the campaigns, the renters, tenants, and tenants unions against evictions. Every single workplace is facing job losses, especially where they're fighting against it with strikes and all the rest. And finally, every cut imposed on the local council or carried out by the local council and government, and fighting every single one. There'll be loads of campaigns around this, but we need to unite that resistance into a mass national campaign driven from the grassroots and controlled by it if we're going to defeat the Tory government and make sure we don't pay the cost of this crisis. Because right now they've already prioritized profit for business, right, and for the government over our health and safety and PPE and all the rest. But now the bill is coming through and they're already talking about how to make us pay for it. And of course, millions already have with their lost jobs. So that's absolutely essential. And then lastly, building that resistance in labor and the trade unions. I think the first thing we need to say is, in terms of anti-capitalist politics, I think that we have to have, a systemic approach. That the rich have piled up trillions in their tax havens over 40 years of neoliberalism, right? We need to seize that wealth and develop a program of public works to put the millions to work who need it and to build the things that we've needed for decades now: more council housing, more nurses, more hospitals. And that's the way to resolve these issues, to put people and the working class above profit. We need to absolutely take that also to the shop floor and to fight for workers' control, to stop every job loss, share out the work with no loss of pay and things like that. And that's the approach that we need, not just demanding things from the government, and that labor does it, but fighting in every neighborhood, in every workplace, in the unions, in every city and nationally to fight for that, for those policies. We've got three crises: the pandemic and the climate crisis demand, nationalized transport, energy, and the health sectors, and any factories or workplaces that are being closed or sacking people, and don't compensate the bosses for it. We don't have the money for that. Right? We've got to absolutely take these together and, under workers and consumers' control, develop a sustainable plan that can resolve the climate crisis and at the same time reverse the economic and other crises. And that's what we mean when we say anti-capitalist policies and a socialist program, one that doesn't stop and say, will the bosses accept this? Will capitalism be profitable? But the things that we need and fought for, not just as policies that maybe a Labour government 10 or 20 years too late from now, hopefully 5 years from now, we'll be able to implement, but that we can fight for here and now. Unfortunately, the trade union and Labour leaders will oppose that, is the truth. And we need a rank and file movement in the unions and to fight for the same sort of members' control in labor, where we should say, look, leaders should be on a skilled worker's wage. Why should they earn 100k, 200k as union leaders? That's ridiculous. They should be recallable and accountable. And the same with the same goes for labor. But the thing is, Momentum can't do that unless it has the same members' democracy. And it can't fight for those policies unless it's decided those policies already itself. The last thing I want to say is that the last time we didn't stop austerity, there were many inspiring movements. The student movement organized itself with delegates from all the universities and organized a very powerful movement, but the trade union leaders stood and trade unions stood on the sidelines. Many people would say maybe it was unrealistic to deliver solidarity, but I think what came next shows the real problems in the unions. The 2011 pension strike, we had the biggest strike in Britain for one day since the 1926 general strike, but the right-wing union leaders caved in immediately and sold out that struggle, I'm sorry to be frank, and went for a deal with the bosses, and then the left leaders didn't go forward. And that inaction meant there wasn't even a mass demonstration against the Tory bill to privatize the NHS. We didn't have a single demonstration against that. And I think that the answer clearly is delegate forms of grassroots organizations that can build national campaigns like the students did, but on a much larger scale, or like the poll tax movement did actually, but on a much larger scale, right, that is against austerity as a whole and unites all the fronts of resistance, can get delegates, not just Labour Party and union branches affiliating from below if the leadership doesn't accept it, but also delegates from workplaces, from tenants associations, from housing estates and working class districts and neighbourhoods. And that's one lesson from that. I think the second lesson is we had a plethora. I was very involved in Leeds Against the Cuts. I helped organize the coaches to all the mass demonstrations in London. But the fact is, we didn't unite them into a national body controlled by the grassroots groups. Instead, these national bodies sort of called themselves at the national level of the great and good and sort of floated above the movement, but without any accountability and without really combining them the way that the students very successfully did. And I think the pension strike shows we need that the struggle for rank and file democracy in the unions is absolutely essential for all of that. So just to end on that, I think that what we're saying is obviously we've got a lot to learn from the movements and we've got to get involved in the heart of struggle, but we've got to say, look, let's think bigger this time and learn those lessons. Let's develop action committees that are open to people, not to shut out people, but are open to them and can really bring together the various fronts of struggle. But let's build councils of action that ultimately can have delegates from workplaces and from districts and from local organization that really have that kind of social power that point towards not just mass struggles against austerity, but also the basis of a new working class order, socialism, that a government itself would be accountable to, not just a few, 100 MPs elected to parliament, but then suspended above the movement once again and not controlled. And, that kind of revolutionary struggle for socialism, that's absolutely essential. And it will come out of that mass resistance. And that's what we have to build. The times require nothing less. I'll end on this. I know these are huge challenges. We all know that. And but we've got to think big. The alienation is there on a mass scale from the system, and the way that the rich have gotten richer and the poor gotten poorer for 3 or 4 decades. The mass anger is there, and we can see it's international. Look at the Black Lives Matter movement. And that will come forward in the attacks of the austerity and the crisis. Millions of people are already feeling it. We need to unite that into an effective mass united resistance at a national and international scale that can not just beat back the bill for the corona crisis, but make sure the bosses pay for it and winning socialism through that struggle. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Marcel, and thanks, Erta. So I'd like to thank our 3 candidates for introducing the platform this evening, and I'm sure I'll be joining all of you in a virtual round of applause or tapping on the table or whatever it is you want to do to show your appreciation for them. So I think that what we've tried to outline there is our offer in this platform, which is trying to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the Corbyn movement and the period that we've all been through in the last years, and offer a bit of a perspective from some of the time before that, and also a bit of perspective for the struggles that are opening up in the period before us. And I think that we'll all understand the inspirational uprising against police terror and racism in the US, and the inspiring solidarity that's been seen particularly in Britain, but also around the world. And to participate in the conversation tonight and look at how the Labour left, which I'm sure is something that we all want to do, is to root ourselves in that movement and the movement of the future, and learn the experiences of the recent past to understand how that we can offer solidarity, leadership and progress in those struggles. So what I'd like to do now is really open it up to discussion and questions. And so you can post your questions on the video and the live stream where you're watching it. Just write your questions in, send them in by message or comment or whatever you want to do. Engage in argument and polemic in the comments underneath the boxes if you want, and we'll do our best to get the candidates to answer your questions. So what I'm going to do now is, well, I'll be chairing, so I'll ask some of the questions on your behalf. And so the first one that I'm going to put to our candidates is, well, probably the one that when this election campaign started and the conditions it started is was on first on our mind, which is the coronavirus crisis and what the candidates think of the existing Labour leadership's response to that and what Momentum can do to respond to the coronavirus crisis. Obviously, we are weeks into the crisis now. We're now coming into the attempt of the government to exit the lockdown phase 2 or phase 1 of phase 3 or whatever they're calling it. So really the question is, what should Momentum and the organised Labour left be doing to respond to the coronavirus crisis in Britain at the moment?
Okay, I can take that one. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to recognize that this government does not, in how it is managing this crisis, does not have our interest at heart. What is happening right now is a systemic crisis of the capitalist system. Everything about it. This isn't just a crisis that's happened just because of the pandemic, although the pandemic itself began partly because of the mass industrial agricultural practices in the capitalist system and our inability to protect, to prioritize health and safety. But what it's going to do is trigger a mass economic crisis, the scale of which most of us have not seen in our lifetimes. So we need to recognize that what the government is doing is it's fighting to put profit first. This is a crisis that threatens the very system, the very operation of capitalism and the system that it relies on, which is the accumulation of profit. And having to shut down the economy for 3 months and dish out all this money to keep it going over this time will mean that now, as the lockdown lifts, there's going to be a huge struggle over who pays for this crisis and how we come out of it. Already we're seeing the government trying to force people back to work in unsafe conditions, to open schools when the infection rate in Britain is still far too high from that, according to scientists, trade unions, and the general public. And we're going to see millions of people out of work. So what we need to do first is recognize that we need to build a movement of resistance. And I think what we've seen is that the Labour Party leadership is not going to put itself at the head of that resistance. It's pursuing a strategy of essentially conciliation with the government on the basis that this is a crisis and we need national unity. It isn't recognizing that actually we're in a extremely polarized class struggle about who will bear the burden of this crisis. So first of all, we need to recognize that and organize ourselves. So I think Momentum needs to put itself at the heart of those struggles, and each local Momentum group needs to draw up a plan for how it's going to lead that fight. It needs to, first of all, we need to raise the call that we won't go back to any unsafe work, and we need to be prepared to enforce that ourselves, through strikes, occupations, protests. In the trade unions, we need to raise the call for workers' control and say that the workers themselves need to be in charge of the health and safety in their workplaces and when they go back to work. We need collectively as communities and workers to come together to actually understand how to get services up and running for to fulfill people's needs after this crisis, to make sure that there's no cuts. Draw up a sort of a people's inventory of what we need in the economy, how to restore resources and accountability in local government and reverse austerity. We need to campaign for the nationalization of the health and social care system, and we need to organize to prepare. We need to maintain the testing system and organize to prepare for the transition out of the crisis.
Thanks for that, Erta. So there's dozens of questions coming through here. So I hope you'll forgive me if you understand that some of your questions are similar to other people's. So I hope you'll accept that some of the questions will be answered, you know, in part or partially by what the candidates say. And of course, if you want to follow up on your questions or you feel it wasn't answered, then do send us a message or get in touch via the email address, and we can set up a call, or we can talk to you about following up those questions or organizing actions with you. So the last question was really about how to resist the effects of the coronavirus crisis and the end of the lockdown. And so this next question, I think, relates quite particularly to that. So sorry I don't have the names of the people who've asked the questions, but this one says, I'm a trade unionist. Our movement is hamstrung by the anti-union laws and union leaders who are too timid. What can Momentum do to revive the movement and fight against the anti-union laws? I think Andy.
I'll speak, yeah. Oh, it's a really good question, because it's true that, I mean, we aren't just key workers, we've also been facing a struggle over the last year against privatization and an outright attempt at union busting and destroying the union and the postal service with it. And we've had 2 injunctions so far that have just kiboshed struggle completely, and where the judges really almost just made up law on the spot that went beyond the anti-union laws, but they can do that because of the way they're structured, because they have so many hoops. I think we have to demand, and I don't think Jeremy Corbyn ever went this far actually, but to repeal all the anti-union laws. You should be able to, if you are, you know, facing victimizations in your own workplace, you should be able to go to other workplaces and demand their solidarity. You should be able to go on strike in support of your local nurses not having PPE. That directly affects you. So I think that ability to go on strike and all this is absolutely essential. And the anti-union laws are there to just put in place a series of hoops that the unions have to jump through. And it gets to the point where if you're a big national set of workers, it's almost impossible to actually have a successful strike. And once you get there, it's in the hands of a Tory judge, probably earns 500k a year. So I think the first thing to do is the unions need to start a campaign against this that isn't just based around lawyers and lobbying, but actually begins to call rallies in local areas, link it to supporting strikes, especially strikes where workers maybe have been forced or felt they've had to walk out illegally because of the strike, because their strikes have been barred, and all that sort of thing, and develop an actual campaign. But I think it's clear that the campaign against the anti-union laws will be developed out of the mass resistance to austerity, and where workers, you know, are forced to take action, whether that fits with the union laws or not. And that's the key thing there. And if we can build the resistance, we can be sure that there will be loads of struggles like that. If Momentum can build solidarity, which any local group can do, if there's a local strike where people have been victimized or walked out or whatever, then build solidarity with that strike and show and try and make that strike win. And show that, you know, by building a solidarity movement, you can do that. But I think at the national level, they'll either be broken and become useless, and that's one perspective. But there needs to be a campaign that links it to active resistance, not just lobbying. And the unions haven't really done that so far, despite talks around the beginning of austerity and under New Labour. So I think I answered that. So if I missed anything, let us know.
No, thanks for that, Andy. So I guess we've had 2 questions about what Momentum can do, but I guess for a lot of people watching this, one of the obvious questions will be, can Momentum actually change any of this? And so our next question is this, which says, a lot of people I know have left Momentum, and I'm thinking of leaving too because of the lack of democracy. The deputy leadership ballot only had Angela Rayner's name on it, for example. What would you do to really democratize Momentum?
Okay, I think this one is very simple. We need a sovereign conference to ensure that everything about what Momentum does is controlled by its members. And that's a policy and a constitutional conference. So we need a new constitution that's going to put the organization in the hands of its members, including all of its data and all of its campaigning tools and priorities. And the members need to have absolute ability to set the organization's political priority. We also need to rebuild the local momentum groups. We need to give the local groups autonomy to carry out their work and work together on local campaigns, but we need to connect that up with a national strategy to avoid falling into a sort of hyper-localism where people just focus on mutual aid and local struggles, but we need to connect it all up into a national strategy of resistance. And we also need to make sure that all Momentum full-time staff and officers are fully accountable to the membership and can be recalled at any time by the membership.
Thanks for that, Erta. So our next question again relates to Momentum, which is that despite what you've said about the struggle for momentum and democracy, Momentum is a powerful machine. And Momentum's had some major failures despite its successes. So for example, in the last NEC elections, it lost to the right. Momentum didn't back open selection in the democracy review. Momentum did a lot, like the reason that there are so many different factions contesting the Momentum elections is because clearly a lot of people who supported Momentum feel that it didn't endorse the views of the grassroots. So why do you think these failures and this divorce between the official Momentum position and the grassroots happened, and how do we stop that from happening again?
So I can answer this one. I think principally it's a question of the policies that Momentum put forward and the way in which its members should participate in formulation of these policies, formulations of its strategies. I think the real turning point was the election for leadership of the Labour Party and deputy leadership of the Labour Party, in a situation where you had a majority of the members who had, for example, supported a Remain vote. They didn't attempt to select candidates who had sort of some kind of even a compromise between internationalism and accepting Brexit. Instead, they selected a candidate who immediately went on the offensive and called for patriotic socialism and also signed up to some of the things that made Momentum supporters most angry during Corbyn's leadership, for instance, saying actually supported the witch hunt against anti-Zionist activists. And this was the start of it. And then even more disgracefully with the deputy leadership contest, actually rejecting and undermining the campaign of the left-wing candidate who, even though I have criticisms of him, Richard Burden, was a far superior candidate, both in his record of activity, his own political views, a far superior candidate to Angela Rayner. But also, I think it's the resistance to members' participation at every stage. The idea that the leadership would determine the main principles of the organisation, and that this wouldn't be given out to members.
Thanks for that, Marcel. So obviously we've started off with a number of questions about Momentum and how that will work. And so now we're going to get on to the real meat of the discussion, which is about how Momentum can intervene into the political situation today. So we're going to kick that right off with a question about the Boris Johnson and the Prime Minister Dominic Cummings. So with the Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings debacle, what do we do to get Keir Starmer and his coterie to go on the offensive? Our observers and the comrades and friends watching this debate will have seen Keir Starmer's particular model of opposition, which is to warn Boris Johnson that he's been put on notice and he should get his act together. So he should get his act together over the herd immunity policy. He should get his act together over the failure to get the number of tests out on time. He should get his act together over the NHS test and trace policy. So really the question for the candidates is, how do we get the leader of the opposition who's been lauded in the media as a credible and serious opposition to actually start opposing the government? Go for it.
Yeah, so I think we need to expose the leadership's lack of spine, because the Labour Party claims to represent the interests of the working class, and it should represent the interests of the working class because it represents hundreds of thousands of working class members who are relying on the Labour Party to represent its interests. But if it doesn't do so, then we need to expose that, and we need to ourselves clearly put forward as a movement the demands that we think are necessary in this crisis, some of which we have put forward in our platform. We need to be, of course, we should demand that the leadership back us. And I think by building, a mass movement in support of those things, we can hopefully pressure and embarrass them into backing us on at least some of those things. But ultimately, we need to not be afraid of breaking away and organizing for those things ourselves. Our success as a movement does not depend on the ballot box, and we don't even know when the next election is going to be. So there's, as Andy was mentioning about the poll tax movement, there's countless examples from history where the Labour Party has not supported the mass movements of struggle which were necessary at the time, and we need to follow in the tradition of those movements and base ourselves on our own socialist politics that we independently set our path for ourselves, and by doing that, pressure the leadership and expose their inadequacies.
Thanks for that, Herta. And I should say that all of these questions are also pitched at the other candidates, who are welcome to contribute, and also to those of you who I see are pitching in online, as usual on Facebook, and so that's excellent to see. So, okay, so I'll go to our next question, which is about, following on from that then. Obviously, one of the things that people have seen, despite the phase 2 of 3 or whatever we're in the lockdown, and maybe one of our candidates can advise us on what stage of the lockdown we're actually in. But what a lot of people looking at this are wondering is, given the COVID-19 crisis, the guidelines on social distancing, the particular problems with Black and minority ethnic people being susceptible to coronavirus, what ideas for organizing have we got, given that this is something that's going to be with us for the long term, given the postponement of Labour conference, given the postponement of meetings and demonstrations and all of the rest of it. So given that this is going to be something, a lifestyle that's going to be with us for a long time, what suggestions do you have for organizing in the time of coronavirus? Andy.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's already been some very good stuff done. There have been socially distanced protests around the opening of schools that have tried to draw in parents groups, and there's been meetings of up to, say, hundreds of parents. And that's been very, I wouldn't say it's been very successful in that the protests have been small, but given the constraints and threats at protests and all the rest, they have taken place. And the same is true of Black Lives Matter and protests in London, for instance, where, as I understand it, thousands came out. So, that's absolutely essential, is to realize that, I think it's a shame that Labour has suspended all its meetings, and I'm not sure it's completely it's very convenient for the leadership because it means that there isn't criticism that can focus on them in terms of Keir Starmer's, I want to be a productive, constructive opposition rather than being a hard-hitting, fighting one. But there have been loads of Zoom meetings about, and I think what I'd say to Momentum is they've been largely absent from them. And to join in with those movements, to join in with the protests, to build them, to mobilize Momentum members, to rebuild those local activist groups. That's absolutely essential. All roads lead through that. If we don't do that as Momentum and the national leadership doesn't facilitate that, then Momentum will remain on the sidelines. And if Momentum isn't fighting to do it, I can't see who else is going to fight to do that in Labour. So I think that's why, so many of our proposals focus in on these questions of democracy, the local groups and activism and all the rest. But I think in terms of I think there's going to be a lot of workplaces. I mean, one of the terrible things is that I think that social distancing has loosened a lot as people have gotten the signal from the government that it's okay, and they look around and they see other people not doing it, and they say, what can we do? But even so, there were a lot of walkouts and protests by workers at the beginning of the process where social distancing wasn't taking place, or where they were being, forced to do things that were unsafe. And or the bosses were using the coronavirus to bring in attacks on workers. And I think once again the second thing is to do everything I just said, but to use it to build solidarity with actual groups of workers, where teachers are actually, like in London for instance, are very active campaigns to say we don't want to go back till it's safe. The 5 tests of the National Education Union have not been met. People shouldn't be going back, and where the teachers are organizing to do that, then Momentum can use its specially placed junction at the crossroads of local groups of activists, of the Labour Party structures, and often in the unions, to try to bring them together into a solidarity movement to support those people and make sure they're not isolated, and to give them confidence and to help them practically and materially to build their campaigns, for instance, to reach out to parents. So I think there's a lot we can do, but you can't do it without local activist groups, and you can't do it without getting involved in the actual attempts that are already taking place and building from there. But if Momentum got itself organized nationally, like we've said before, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, left organization with the biggest number of members and probably the biggest concentration of activists in Britain. And if it became a democratically organized movement, it could be extremely effective, not just in taking part in the struggles, but actually initiating them. And I think that's what we've got to look out for. Workers who are in struggle in favor of health and safety against unscrupulous bosses that just want to fight for the bottom line and to cut costs, and taking up those struggles and supporting them in trying to collect our trade unionists together in the unions and to take a rank and file approach to them and organize the rank and file too, which by the way is also quite an important aspect to get the union leaders to fight the anti-union laws, which we were talking about earlier.
Thanks for that, Neil. So my next question is, well, it comes from what the candidates have been discussing this evening, and it says that obviously what the Anticapitalist Platform is proposing is a series of concrete policies that actually relate to the struggles that working class people, voters for the Labour Party, members of trade unions are actually facing, and how the Labour left who are involved in those struggles can coordinate, link up and form a united resistance out of them. But in Momentum, that seems to be quite a rare feature. And I guess the question is, relating to that, well, Forward Momentum, Momentum Renewal, all these other factions that are standing in Momentum, they don't propose, they're not talking about the struggles that Labour Party members and supporters are actually involved in. And so the question is, why didn't you join the Forward Momentum primaries? If you think that Momentum should have a different policy, why didn't you join those primaries and get involved in that?
Well, I was interested to see Forward Momentum as a development. I didn't think we should participate in it from the beginning, but basically the main issue I had with them is that it seemed to try and be 2 things at the same time. One was sort of an open platform in which people who were sort of vaguely against the status quo in Momentum could put their pitch forward and get elected and carry out those policies should they be selected to go on the slate. At the same time, it seemed to be an organisation that had a founding set of principles that were quite clear on a number of issues, a number of strategies. And I think it was quite eclectic, opportunistic to try and be with things at the same time. And you had quite an odd spectacle where you had actually quite staunchly different candidates with different positions debating each other in their open primaries. But at the same time, this was a group who had determined its principles already, and by all accounts, some of the sort of candidates who were selected who potentially don't agree with this statement of principles are being sidelined and not allowed to put those forward. But another interesting development in forward momentum was a group called Momentum Internationalists, and on a couple of occasions people have said to me, well, this is a group that has similar views to you, why don't you join them and help them to win over forward momentum? And my response was, actually, I don't consider us to have similar views on a number of questions to the Momentum Internationalists, and you know, some of them we've agreed with on the question of what to do after Brexit, for example. But this debate about momentum goes beyond a few issues, and it's about an overall strategy for how to fight for ideas within momentum. And if they're not willing to be even prepared to call for a break with the bureaucracy of momentum, then I can't see how that can be the basis of some sort of cooperation. So, and as well as that, topic I covered in my introduction, the expulsion of anti-Zionists from the Labour Party, the adoption of the IHRA. Members of Momentum Internationalists have entirely opposite views on that question that we do, and I don't think that could be the basis for a political alliance, even if we share some sort of broader agreement on the question of momentum having to be democratized. I think we go a lot further than any of the factions within forward momentum on those questions.
Yeah, just a quick addition on that point as well. I think that what we're putting forward uniquely, I think, is a strategic and political perspective for the movement about how it should organize, what its relationship should be to the Labour Party, and a new and different approach to its own independence. I think that the other organizations contesting for momentum are contesting it because they want to, their goal is to build a consensus within the Labour Party for a set of positions broadly consistent with Corbyn's manifesto, which means continuing to manage the movement to keep it within the bounds of what's acceptable to MPs and trade union leaders, rather than putting the movement on a fighting footing independently.
Yeah, I'd just add, if I could, I think that's all absolutely correct. But I also think there's two things. One is, I can't see how the Momentum Internationalists who joined the Way Forward have changed its line at all. And I think that if you join something big like that, basically you're just going to get lost in it. Whereas we think that this is a real turning point for the left, and it needs a radical change of direction. You've got to have a clear voice on that if you want to get through, rather than be muffled by being part of a large sort of blobbier thing. And I think a crucial aspect of it is it's retained, it has sharpened. I think that they've certainly, I think because they're not the only game to the left of momentum renewal, they've been forced to clarify and concretize their proposals, but their idea is still for just a restart conference. How it will be held, they don't say. And then just to continue on with the NCG hanging over the membership without that actual control by the local organizations. And I think that's wrong. And it's very, very fuzzy, as Urta says, on what we face as a resistance. What are the lessons? How can we go forward? How do we organize so that we can win this crucial, gigantic battle that the working class, the poor and the oppressed face against austerity and climate and the rest? And you know, it's not enough to just get elected to a leadership and then sort it out yourselves while the members have an occasional say maybe through an e-democratic referendum or consultation. That's not enough. And I think they're very inadequate, their proposals. And I don't think that we would have affected them very much. I think they would have co-opted us, but we're trying to have a clear message to get that out to members so that to have a real debate in Momentum, not sort of like the old ways with Momentum Renewal, and then the sort of old ways light with Forward Momentum.
Thanks for that, comrades. So everyone pitching in there on the different factions within Momentum, and just to add here that we are supporting the call by Forward Momentum and other campaigns in the Labour left to calling on official Momentum, the Momentum office, to organise hustings in its own elections, something which it didn't organise or didn't say that it would do. At the moment, as far as we understand, it's still not proposing to do. So we've joined with other campaigns to call on Momentum to organise hustings in what we believe is, well, it will be the first openly contested, real, genuine elections in Momentum's history. So it's a very important moment. We're supporting that call. Hopefully Momentum will organise those hustings and allow its 40,000 members and hopefully the wider Labour and Socialist left to participate in those hustings and observe those debates and participate in a turning point for the Labour left after 5 years of Corbynism. But if they don't, then we've committed to supporting calls for informal or unofficial hustings, which will hopefully be as representative as possible of all of the different candidates participating in the Momentum elections. So stay in touch and we'll let you know about that. But if you don't hear anything, then please do contact your local Momentum officers, anyone you know in the Momentum office, email them, ask them. If you're a member of Momentum or a member of the Labour Party, please say that you would like to participate in hustings and have the opportunity to hear all the different candidates say what they think. And we'd appreciate that, and we think it's an important democratic opportunity for the Labour left. So our next question, moving away from the internal question of organising on the Labour left, is for the next 15 minutes until the end of the meeting, is some of the bigger questions facing us. And of course, that's why we're all in Momentum in the first place. So to kick it off, to stop climate change, we need an international movement. How do you think we can do that? And how can we persuade people that capitalism can't solve climate change? Have I been cut off? Okay, obviously, sorry, technical problem now. We'll come back to that one. I'll come back to this one. Okay, so our next question is from someone who says, when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, the left was, or had the appearance of unity and so on, and everyone was behind him and his project, or what he, as a leader, represented as the project of hundreds of thousands of people who rejoined the Labour Party, were involved in all these different movements. But as soon as he was defeated after the last election and then resigned, the NEC election was lost, and then the leadership contest and so on. So the question is, how can the Labour left unite again in the way that it was before? Is that desirable? Is that what we want?
Last week, I mean, I was just speaking to some Momentum people about that today, and you know, in our local CLP, the left didn't coordinate, and there was no Momentum meetings or anything, and the right got in because the left stood against each other, the NCG, etc., and all the rest. I think the left needs to unite, but unite to defend Jeremy Corbyn against the right, But that doesn't mean just cheerleading everything that Jeremy Corbyn would do, or any other Labour leader or the union leaders, but rather having an independent critical standpoint and demanding that members are the ones who make the policy, like, as Marcel said on Brexit. I think the same thing comes to when there's a slate. I mean, this isn't true of Momentum because we're trying to sort out the left, and therefore we need to have a proper sort of debate and debate of ideas and different platforms and all the rest. But I mean, when it comes to, for instance, the Labour leadership, I expect that someone like Richard Burgon would, as people said already, would, you know, come forward as a candidate or someone who was on the left, and I expect that, you know, people would probably unite behind them. And but Momentum, because it refused to consult the members and just imposed it, meant that the members didn't obey it. And you know, and without democracy, you can't have that kind of loyalty if you don't have people making the decisions themselves, and if they're not active, which raises their horizons and makes them think more radically. So as I understand your question, which is the question of unity, hasn't the left just keep defeating itself? Well, I mean, which unity? Keir Starmer wants us to unite now, not criticize him. We obviously can't do that. And I think the other sort of slates and platforms for Momentum, you know, also use the idea of unity. But I think we need to say to MPs and councillors and other people, of course, we want to build a left that involves those people, but it's got to be a left where the members make the decisions and then those people agree to carry them out in a fashion that accepts that members' democracy if they want to be a candidate of the left, etc. It doesn't mean that if they didn't agree to that we wouldn't then back them critically because they were the best person to defeat the right, or they were the people who were leading the left, and people looked to them and had hopes in them, and so we had to, you know, work with those hopes and all the rest. But you know, unity can't come without democracy, and it can't come with a lack of independence and an uncritical cheerleading of the left leaders and all the rest. I mean, every time Corbyn made a decision, it was everybody, you know, lined up on the left to say Corbyn's played a blinder, etc. It didn't matter how bad the fudge was or the concession. And I think we can't have that again. But unity comes with democracy.
Thank you, Andy. So our next question is, a lot of people, so this is, well, it was a topical one, and of course with coronavirus, the B word has been forgotten about or banned and banished from the papers. But of course, as attentive observers will know, we've only got until the 1st of July to ask the European Union for an extension to the transition period. So given the well, what I think that most of our viewers will agree was the motivating force behind the Brexit vote, and clearly a dividing line within the organised factions of the Labour Party, if not necessarily amongst Labour Party members and voters. I think it's one worth discussing again. So this question is, a lot of people oppose immigration, and a lot of people in Labour think that we need to listen to the concerns about immigration to win back seats in the North. If Momentum opposed immigration controls and fought for that policy in Labour, do you think that would be a realistic path to electoral success?
Okay, first of all, I don't think that we should, our starting point for our politics should be what is the path to electoral success. Our starting point for our politics should be how do we fight for socialism and what is in the interests of the working class as socialists. And that is the starting point. And from there, we build the movement in order to win support for our politics. And that was, I think, the mistake of the Corbyn leadership on Brexit, is that it tried to please everyone. It tried to make an electoral calculation, and it tried to avoid taking a position, and it tried to please everyone. And it didn't recognize what the objective facts of the situation, which was that Brexit was being driven by an extremely harmful xenophobic narrative of nationalist protectionism, and it was also being driven by the forces of international finance capital wanting to come in and privatize and deregulate the economy. And all of that has resulted in a devastating effect on attitudes to migrants in this country, incidents of racist hate crimes are up. Obviously, the Tories have now pushed through an extremely regressive immigration bill, which is rolling back the fundamental rights that people had to come and live here from across Europe. And so I think that, you know, as the socialist movement, we need to put ourselves boldly in the lead with internationalist politics. We need to tell people that the reason that there is austerity, that there's stagnating wages, all the reasons that people voted for Brexit, the reasons that people think that there shouldn't be more immigration, i.e. driving down wages, and there's not enough resources to go around. We have more than enough resources to go around. It's just that too much of them is being taken away from us by the business owners and the capitalists. And we need to organize the workers from all around the world to organize themselves for better wages, better conditions. And we need to explain to people that the reason that there are stagnating wages, austerity, left behind communities, all this stuff, is not because of migrants, but because of the way the capitalist system works. We need to organize them in solidarity, hand in hand, with migrants in order to improve all of our conditions, working conditions and living conditions, living standards.
Thank you, Erta. So I think we've had some questions about climate change and the environmental struggle, which I think Marcel wants to come in on.
Yep, I can answer those. A question was asked about international cooperation on the question of climate change. And I think this is obviously a very urgent task for us, because climate change is an international crisis. It's not one that's developing in individual countries completely independently from one another. And I think the basis of the cooperation will have to be on between workers and socialists who are active in politics and the climate movement. I don't think they can rely on, for instance, leaders of the unions of the social democratic parties, or even some of the radical left parties around the world. I don't think they have the capacity to make these international links. That the people who can is going to be class conscious rank and file activists in these parties and unions. And I think what the unifying factor can be in these international alliances is actually recognition that the climate crisis is a crisis of capitalism. It's not a crisis of the wrong kind of capitalism. And I think actually, if we learn the right lessons from the corona crisis, then this becomes even more clear. I mean, on the one hand, it wouldn't be the first time that I've heard someone say that, for example, oh look, capitalism always had the capacity to solve homelessness, because after the corona crisis started, homeless people were taken off the streets. But what we're seeing now is that's not really the case. That these problems can be temporarily eradicated, but even in the space of a couple of months, capital is now reorganized to demand completely against the welfare of all people in this country, that there's a return to work, and that people continue to put their lives at risk to earn profits for them. And I think that will be precisely the same problem with climate change. Capitalism will prove itself to be incapable of reform in order to tackle the crisis of climate. And I think cast for Momentum and the Labour left in Britain will be to do some work with intervening into groups like Extinction Rebellion, because on the one hand, it was a very welcome development that there was suddenly a mass movement for climate. But there are a lot of political shortcomings that Extinction Rebellion had. One was that it just wasn't very political in the first place. That its analysis of climate was sort of based on government rather than this nexus between major polluting industries, the state and the state's institutions like army, for example, which are responsible for a huge amount of carbon emissions. And I think the failure goes two ways. It wasn't just a failure of Extinction Rebellion not to raise these demands. It was also a failure of Labour and the Labour left to make political interventions into Extinction Rebellion. So I think that is something that has to change in Britain, at least.
Thanks, Marcel. So what we've tried to do with the Anticapitalist Platform is to really raise not just the questions of Momentum's internal process or democracy or the problems of organization and things like that, or peripheral things like, or abstract questions of more integration with communities, or questions which everyone can agree with but mean everything to everyone. What we've tried to do here is to raise the big questions facing the working class and the oppressed communities, not just in Britain but across the world, the things that the problems that we face in common, of exploitation, of sexism, of racism, of climate change, of the refugee crisis, all of these problems that unite us, which impact us all. And so that's the reason that tonight we've saved the most important questions, in a sense, for last, the questions of the discussion of the inspiring uprising against police terror and state racism in the USA, and the inspiring demonstrations that we've seen, not just the huge demonstration yesterday in London, but the demonstrations in most of the London boroughs at the same time, and all across the country in almost any town in Britain of any significant size at 1 p.m. And in the evening after work. And I think that that's a truly inspiring way to, well, given that the government has given up on the lockdown, I think that it's a telling and inspiring way for the multinational working class of Britain to express its solidarity with those fighting back in America, and what a way to end the lockdown. So I want to end tonight's discussion with questions to the candidates, which is, well, there have been dozens of questions along these lines, but I'll take Rich's, which I think is well formulated. The huge US-wide upsurge against racism and police oppression has sent shockwaves across the world, and there is a growing movement in solidarity in many other countries, including the UK. What huge demonstrations we've seen in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and many other places. How do you see this as part of the overall picture you've painted? Where does this mass mobilization still breaking around us fit in? And that's to all of our candidates.
I mean, I'll start off if that's all right. Yeah, it has been really inspiring, and it shows the way that the class antagonisms have really developed and sharpened, and you can get that kind of outpouring for an issue that obviously is absolutely based in Britain. I don't think a single police officer has been convicted since 1968 for the death of somebody in custody, but, you know, comes from another country, and the internationalism and spontaneous of the movement. What do we need to do? I think, you know, there's calls to defund the police on being placed as a demand on councillors and senators and all the rest in America. I think that's fine as far as it goes, but I think we need to disarm them too, and ultimately disband them. I think we need to call for the abolition of the police and say, you know, the community can police itself. If we had a national system of training where the people were, you know, trained to do that, and it was accountable to the community. And the fact is, you know, there's been anti-fascist movements in Britain and internationally in Europe and elsewhere that have had to defend themselves because the police won't defend them from the fascists, and defend themselves sometimes from the police who pick on the anti-fascists but not the fascists of who they sympathize with. And therefore that self-defense is part of, you know, the struggles against oppression today, defending, you know, the protesters having to defend themselves from the police in America, who are completely off the leash, etc., and incredibly well armed. But it's not just a problem for America. It will be a problem for here too if we do build a mass movement of mass resistance. So I think we have to have a consistent demand, just like we say, look, nationalize without compensation, etc. We have to say, you know, self-defense is no offense. and you've always got the right to self-defend yourself, but that has to be organized and built as part of a mass movement. But part of that is also demand this, no confidence in the police at all. Community control doesn't work. We had the Labour set up the independent police complaints commission to sort of try to stop the police killing black men and black people and unarmed people, and who they rounded up for this reason or stopped on the street, and it didn't work, and no one was ever prosecuted, and half the time it turned out most of their investigators were ex-police anyways, because who knows how to investigate these things. So it's just a dead end to think that we can go down that road. We have to have a radical systemic answer to it, which is disband the police. They are there to police the working class community, particularly its poorest elements, and will always have racism built into them as a result. And therefore we need an absolutely different root and branch solution to that as part of a socialist and anti-capitalist solution. Defund, disarm, disband, and abolish the police. And I think that's what we have to say, and it'd be interesting to hear what the others have to say.
Thanks for that, Andy. So I think we've got Etta next. Yeah,
I mean, absolute solidarity with the protest, extremely inspiring. And I think, what's really exciting about these protests is that they are drawing systemic conclusions. People are consciously and actively recognizing that these crimes are not the exception or just sort of one-off incidents. They're actually drawing the conclusions about institutional racism and the way that it's stitched into the very foundations of our social system, which has been built by, centuries of plunder and enslavement of Black and brown people. And in terms of the police specifically, people are recognizing in the movement, it's basing its demands on the fact that the police are their job is to protect private property and the capitalist system. They are the organized and violent wing of the capitalist state. So when we talk about defunding the police or abolishing the police, I think we should recognize that the confines of the current system will never allow us to do that. The ruling class will never allow us to do that unless we can actually replace the current system, which requires a violent policing of resistance by the ruling classes in order to avoid the systemic threat that it poses to their rule. So that's, I think, the really exciting thing about this movement. And right now, there's a lot of, spontaneous anger, but what we need to fight for is the structures of organization which can sustain this anger and turn it into an organized resistance. And the uprisings and the anti-racist movement is not the only kind of issue-based movement which is drawing these systemic conclusions. You've got the climate strikes, the women's movements, all of these different movements recognizing that what they're up against is not just one government's policy, not just something that they can win, or if they do win concessions, it can always be rolled back. What they're all recognizing separately from each other is that they're fighting against a social system. And what we, I think, as socialists need to fight for is to connect up all those movements with a common strategy and help them to consciously recognize that they share a common goal and organize themselves as an anti-systemic resistance, whilst, of course, pursuing their particular aims, but also recognizing their common goals.
Thank you, Etta. So I'd like to thank all of our candidates tonight. And I think on that note, on the question of Black Lives Matter, for those of you watching from home, from Zoom, from, not on Zoom, but on Facebook, on Twitter, wherever you're watching, I think that one of the most inspiring things about this movement and the way that we'd like to take the struggle forward for Momentum in the Labour Party is one of the things that this has done is in the period of social distancing, social isolation, atomization of the working class, the mass unemployment that has happened in America and that is coming in Britain. One of the most inspiring things is that this massive movement of anti-racist resistance that's been taken up has been a mass movement of turning individual people back into a collective, a way of you know, understanding the collective power of things, turning into a subject and actor for themselves. And I think that that's the most important thing. And I think that that's one of the inspiring things that we can take away from perhaps quite a demoralizing experience of the coronavirus, the deaths, the personal problems, and all the pressures that everyone has been under. The fact that it's ended with a bang and not a whimper. I think that this movement of resistance and you know, everything that it represents on both sides of the channel in Britain and the UK, but also the massive movements of solidarity elsewhere. I think that that's the spirit that we've got to take forwards with us. And that's what the Anticapitalist Platform stands for. That's what separates us from the rest of the other platforms that are standing in Momentum, that are talking about democracy and tinkering around the edges. We are putting forward a platform that relates to the struggles that are going on in the real world, on the streets and in the communities, and saying it's not just about supporting what people are doing, but actually offering a strategy and saying the system cannot provide for us. It couldn't provide for us before. Coronavirus, the climate crisis, the racist crisis, the sexist crisis, all of these crises, you know, have gone beyond breaking point. And so what we're doing is saying that recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of the previous movement and Corbyn and what he did, all those who want to go beyond that and actually fight back and raise their fists, join the Anti-Capitalist Platform, get involved in our campaign. If you've enjoyed what you've heard tonight, if you've got questions about what we've said, get involved, get in touch with us, ask our candidates questions. We've got a five-step program of how you can help support the campaign and get involved and promote it amongst your friends and contacts in the Labour Party, in Momentum, and beyond that in the wider Labour and Socialist left. So I'd like to thank our candidates, and more importantly, I'd like to thank all of those who listened and participated and contributed questions. So please get in touch and, well, please nominate our candidates if you can do, if you're in the appropriate region, particularly if you're in the North, Scotland and the rest of the world. And otherwise, hopefully see you all soon. So thank you and solidarity.